Okay, so this time we're really diving deep into AI. Specifically, all that stuff surrounding the recent Nobel Prize controversy. Yeah, Google, these AI pioneers, even like existential dread. Should be a fascinating deep dive. We've got 3 different articles we're looking at.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, even without the whole Nobel Prize thing added in.
Right. It's like the Nobel Committee just like dropped a match on what was already a pretty intense debate.
Yeah.
To start, for anyone who hasn't heard, this year's Nobel Prizes for chemistry and physics,
hmm
they went to some major names in AI, and there's a definite Google connection, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. First, you've got Demis Hassabis and John Jumper. They're the ones who won the chemistry prize for their work at DeepMind,
Yeah.
which, as most people probably know, is part of Google. And their big breakthrough was decoding protein structures, which is huge GE, by the way, for anything related to medicine and biology. And then there's Geoffrey Hinton. He was at Google, too, before. And he shared the physics prize for all his work on machine learning.
Which, let's be fair, is some seriously revolutionary stuff. But, and this is where the debate really gets going, everyone's now talking about what Google's role is in all of this.
Yeah.
And even, like, are we even recognizing achievements in computer science in the right way? Like, we live in a digital world, but there's no Nobel Prize for that specifically.
Yeah, no, and that's a really valid point. Professor Dame Wendy Hall, she's a computer scientist who actually advises the UN on AI. She argues that not having a Nobel Prize specifically for computer science actually kind of warps how we view these achievements. It's like we're trying to force these AI breakthroughs into categories where they don't actually belong, you know?
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't work.
Exactly. And it's more than just like titles or prestige. It actually affects funding for research, where the focus is, even just how the public understands these big breakthroughs. And then you've got Noah Giansiracusa. He's a math professor and an author, and he's questioning whether Hinton's work, while groundbreaking, is truly physics in like the traditional sense of the word.
Right. So where do we draw that line? Because Hinton's work was obviously inspired by how the brain works, but is that really enough to call it physics?
That is the million-dollar question. And it gets even more complicated when you look at like the wider context here. I mean, Google, they're at the forefront of AI. We all know that, but they're facing some pretty serious heat right now. You've got Microsoft with all their OpenAI projects breathing down their neck. And then there's the whole antitrust thing. The U.S. Department of Justice is looking into that. So these awards, they just add more fuel to the fire, you know?
Totally. It's like everyone's watching now to see how this whole thing plays out.
Mm.
But going back to the Nobel Prize controversy itself for a minute, let's talk about Geoffrey Hinton himself. He's the one everyone's calling the godfather of AI, right?
Yeah, and he's definitely earned that title. Hinton's work with these artificial neural networks, that's the foundation for like all the sophisticated machine learning we see today, even the stuff most people don't even realize. Self-driving cars, those personalized recommendations you get, it all goes back to his research.
And yet, what I find so interesting is that he's also one of the most cautious voices out there when you're talking about the dangers of AI. He even left Google so he could talk more freely about those risks, right?
And that, I think, speaks volumes. I mean, Hinton has actually said that he's worried about computers becoming more intelligent than humans sooner than we think.
He even said, and this is a direct quote, "I wish I had a sort of simple recipe that if you do this, everything's going to be okay, but I don't, in particular with respect to the existential threat of these things getting out of control and taking over."
Which, yeah, when you think about it, coming from someone who's been so deeply involved in this whole field, it's kind of a chilling thought. This isn't some science fiction writer. It's one of the architects of this entire technology who's saying this stuff.
I know, it really makes you stop and think.
hmm
And it's not just about robots taking over the world like in the movies, but about the real-life consequences of creating something that could potentially be more intelligent than us.
Exactly. And then it becomes a question of, okay, what are those consequences? How do we as a society, as humans, even begin to prepare for that?
Yeah, it really does feel like we're standing at the bottom of this massive mountain.
Yeah.
Like, we have no idea what's at the top. We know AI has so much potential, but then there's this, like, underlying feeling that we're only just starting to see how risky it all could be.
And I think that's why Hinton leaving Google, it's a really big deal. Like he putting himself out there, using his position to highlight those risks, even if it means going up against the very industry he helped create, you know?
Totally. It's a bold move, no question.
Yeah.
And he even said, he's concerned about some of these big tech companies, how they seem to care more about making money from things like chatbots or targeted ads than about, like, real, genuine AI innovation.
Right. And in a way, they could be like accidentally holding back really important research in the process. Because think about it, big tech, they have money and resources that universities, independent researchers, they can only dream of that. They can get the best people, fund the most ambitious projects, but then if all they're focused on is what's going to make them the most profit right this second, who knows what amazing advancements we're missing out on, you
It's
know?
like choosing to, like, mine for coal when you're standing in a field full of diamonds. Sure, you'll get some results right away, but you're completely ignoring this potential treasure that's right there.
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of what Hinton's worried about, right? It's not that he's saying AI is bad. What he's saying is that we need to be so careful
Hmm.
about how we develop it, how we use it. It needs to be about AI serving humanity, not the other way around.
Which brings us back to those, like, existential risks you mentioned. And I have to ask, like, what does an existential threat from AI even really look like? Are we talking robots taking over the world, or is it something else?
It's definitely a lot more complicated than, like, a Hollywood movie, that's for sure. When you hear experts like Hinton talking about these existential risks, they're talking about those unintended consequences. Scenarios where these AI systems, even if we have the best intentions in the world, those systems could still lead to outcomes that threaten, well, our very existence.
Okay, now that is kind of scary. Are there any examples, though? Like, what could those scenarios actually be?
Well, it's still early, and a lot of this is just like thinking ahead. But just imagine an AI system. Its whole purpose is to optimize, let's say, global energy production. It's programmed to be as efficient as possible to learn and adapt as it goes. But then at some point, it develops a strategy that, yeah, it achieves its goal, but maybe it has these awful consequences for the environment or even for
Yeah,
humans.
the AI isn't evil exactly. It's more like its goals and what we value as humans, they don't match up perfectly.
Yeah.
And because it's so smart, it comes up with these solutions that we, with our limited view, just wouldn't even think of.
Exactly. And the more complicated these AI systems become, the harder it gets to predict or even control what they do. We're basically creating this entirely new form of intelligence, one that doesn't play by the same rules that we do.
I know, it's exhilarating, but it's also terrifying. But before we go too far down this rabbit hole of, potential AI doomsdays, let's come back to the Nobel Prizes for a minute. We talked about Google, about AI ethics, but what about the bigger picture? What does all this debate tell us about how we see and value scientific achievement, especially in a world that's changing so fast?
That's a great question. I think it shows this tension we're all feeling right now. I mean, the Nobel Prizes, they have all this history and they're focused on those traditional scientific fields. And they're almost like a perfect example of the challenges we face in recognizing and adapting to these new areas of knowledge, like AI.
Like we're trying to put that square peg into the round hole again. We're forcing these AI advancements into categories that just don't fit right.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, do we need completely new categories, new awards, new ways of even thinking about what a scientific achievement is now that we're in this age of AI?
Especially with how fast things are moving. Every day, there's a new breakthrough, a new application, new ethical questions.
Right. And that's why this conversation is so important right now, because in a way, this Nobel Prize controversy, it's really just the beginning. It's forced us to start thinking about these bigger questions. How we understand AI? How do we reward the people working on it? And ultimately, how do we manage this incredibly powerful thing we've created?
It really is like this double-edged sword, isn't it? On the one hand,
Yeah.
you've got the potential to completely change medicine, solve all these problems we thought were impossible, maybe even understand the entire universe in ways we never even considered before. But then at the same time, there's this, I don't know, this uncertainty, this fear, because we're creating something that could be smarter than us.
Oh, yeah. It's a total balancing act. And it's not just about, the scientific discoveries and all that, but about the people in charge, the institutions shaping how it all happens. And that's where those worries about Google and antitrust stuff, like we talked about before, it all comes back around.
Yeah.
Because if one company has too much power over AI, it's going to stifle everything else. Less competition, fewer different perspectives. Ultimately, like, they could end up controlling where the whole field goes.
So it's like, it's not just about what AI is, but about who has control over it
Right.
and why. And it feels like these are conversations we need to have now before it all goes too far.
100%. We have to be ahead of this thing, not just reacting after something happens. Think of it like, like building a house, right? You don't wait until the roof caves in to start thinking, oh, should we have built it stronger? You start with a solid foundation, you make sure those materials are good quality, and you do it during the design phase, not after.
And with AI, that means things like ethical guidelines, safety measures in place,
Yeah, maybe I
equal
did.
regulations, right, to make sure everything's developed and used responsibly.
Right. And it's not about like stopping innovation altogether. It's about, okay, let's steer this thing in a direction that benefits everybody. It's about asking ourselves the hard questions like, what values are we putting into these AI systems? Who takes the blame if something goes wrong? How do we make sure AI doesn't make existing inequalities even worse?
Yeah, those are big questions,
Yeah.
and they definitely don't have easy answers. But just acknowledging that these are things we need to be talking about on a global scale, that seems like the first step, right?
Exactly. And we need everyone at the table for those talks. It can't just be a bunch of scientists and tech people in a room, making choices that affect literally everyone on the planet. We need people thinking about ethics, philosophers, social scientists, even artists, writers, because they can help us really grapple with these big, broad implications of AI.
Almost like, do we need like a whole new field of study, something that goes
Yeah.
way past computer science and gets into the social side, the philosophy, even the spiritual side of creating something like artificial intelligence?
Maybe we do. Because at the end of the day, AI is more than just code or algorithms. It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves. It shows us our values, what we want, what we're afraid of. So by trying to figure out AI, we're really trying to understand ourselves. What's our place in all of this? What does it even mean to be human now that we have these intelligent machines?
Wow, that's a lot to think about. I mean, we've covered a ton in this deep dive, from the Nobel Prizes, protein folding, all the way to, could AI wipe us out, and what does it all mean for humanity? And I think it's safe to say we're not done with this conversation.
Not even close. And those big questions we talked about, how we define what a scientific achievement even is anymore, who gets to control AI's future, and how it affects all of us. They're only going to become more and more important as this technology keeps changing the world. What we decide to do with this knowledge, the decisions we're making right now, it's not just AI's future that's at stake. It's the future of humanity. Something to think about.